The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window of our small apartment, casting golden streaks across the breakfast table where I sat with my husband, Marcus. 5 years of marriage had taught me to read the subtle signs in his face. Today, something was different. His dark eyes held an excitement that made my stomach flutter with unease. "Sarah, you're going to love this," Marcus said, his voice carrying that familiar tone he used when he thought he was being clever. "My brothers and I have planned something special for you." I looked up from my coffee, studying his face. Marcus was a good man, but sometimes his idea of fun didn't align with mine. His brothers, Jake and Tom, were cut from the same cloth. 3 grown men who still found humor in the kinds of pranks that should have been left behind in high school. "What kind of special?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Marcus grinned, that boyish smile that had first caught my attention at a college party 7 years ago. "It's a surprise. Just trust me, okay? Pack a bag for the weekend. We're going on a little road trip." The unease in my stomach grew stronger, but I nodded. Marriage was about trust, wasn't it? About giving your partner the benefit of the doubt, even when every instinct told you to ask more questions. 2 hours later, I found myself in the back seat of Jake's pickup truck, squeezed between overnight bags and camping gear. Marcus sat up front with Jake, while Tom followed behind us in his own car. The radio played softly, and the brothers chatted about work, sports, anything except where we were actually going. The city slowly gave way to suburbs, then to farmland, then to nothing but empty highway stretching toward the horizon. I watched the landscape change through the passenger window, feeling increasingly isolated with each mile that passed. "How much farther?" I asked after we'd been driving for over 2 hours. "Not much longer now," Jake called back, catching my eye in the rearview mirror. There was something in his expression that I couldn't quite read, something that made the flutter of unease in my chest grow into something more substantial. We drove for another hour before Jake pulled off the highway onto a dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere. The truck bounced and rattled over potholes and loose gravel, kicking up clouds of dust that obscured the view behind us. When we finally stopped, we were in the middle of what appeared to be an abandoned camping area, surrounded by nothing but scrub brush and distant hills. "Here we are," Marcus announced, climbing out of the truck with an enthusiasm that felt forced. I stepped out and looked around, my heart beginning to race. This wasn't a campground. There were no facilities, no other campers, no signs of life anywhere, just empty land stretching in every direction under an indifferent sky. "Marcus, what is this place?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He exchanged a look with his brothers, and I saw something pass between them, a silent communication that excluded me completely. "Well, here's the thing, Sarah," Marcus began, his tone shifting to something I'd never heard before, something cold. "We thought it would be funny to see how you'd handle being on your own for a while." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" Jake laughed, but it wasn't a kind sound. "It's a prank, Sarah. We're going to leave you here for a couple hours. See if you can figure out how to survive without us taking care of everything for you." I stared at them, unable to process what I was hearing. "You can't be serious." "Come on," Tom chimed in, his voice carrying that same cruel amusement. "It'll be character building. You're always saying you're independent. Here's your chance to prove it." The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. These three men, one of whom I had promised to love and honor for the rest of my life, were planning to abandon me in the middle of nowhere as some kind of joke. "Marcus," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "please tell me this isn't happening." For a moment, just a moment, I saw something flicker across his face. Doubt, maybe, or regret. But then his brothers clapped him on the back, and whatever humanity I'd glimpsed disappeared. "Don't worry," he said, not meeting my eyes. "We'll be back before dark. Just ... figure it out, okay?" They climbed back into their trucks, leaving me standing in a cloud of dust and disbelief. The engines roared to life, and I watched the taillights disappear down the dirt road, taking with them everything I thought I knew about the man I had married. The silence that followed was complete. No traffic, no voices, no sounds of civilization. Just the whisper of wind through dry grass and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had just happened. This wasn't a prank. Pranks were supposed to be harmless, temporary inconveniences that everyone could laugh about later. This was something else entirely. This was cruel. As the reality of my situation sank in, I felt something inside me break. Not just my heart, though that was shattered too. Something deeper. The trust that had been the foundation of my marriage. The belief that the person who claimed to love me would never deliberately hurt me. But as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, I realized something else. I wasn't the helpless woman they thought I was. I had grown up in rural Montana before moving to the city for college. I knew how to read the landscape, how to find water, how to signal for help if necessary. More than that, I had my cell phone. It took me 20 minutes of walking to find a spot with decent signal. But eventually, I managed to call for a ride. A local taxi service. Expensive, but willing to make the long drive out to collect a stranded woman by the time Marcus and his brothers returned, laughing and joking, as if they were coming back from a successful hunting trip. I was gone. The divorce papers were filed 3 days later. 5 years passed like pages turning in a book I was finally ready to close. I had moved back to Montana, taken a job as a park ranger, and slowly rebuilt my life from the ground up. The mountains became my sanctuary, the endless sky my cathedral. I learned to trust myself again. I learned that being alone wasn't the same as being abandoned, and that strength came from within, not from the approval of others. Most importantly, I met David. David was everything Marcus wasn't. Kind without expecting credit. Strong without needing to prove it. Funny in ways that lifted people up instead of tearing them down. He was a veterinarian who had moved to Montana from Colorado, drawn by the same wide open spaces that had called me home. We met when I brought in an injured hawk I'd found on patrol. I watched him work with gentle, capable hands, speaking in soft tones to calm the frightened bird. When he looked up and smiled at me, something in my chest that had been closed for years began to open again. Our relationship grew slowly, like a plant finding its way toward sunlight. David never rushed, never pushed, never made me feel like I had to be anything other than exactly who I was. When he asked me to marry him under a canopy of stars beside a mountain lake, I said yes, without hesitation. Our wedding was simple, beautiful, perfect. Just our closest friends and family, gathered in a meadow overlooking the valley where we'd built our life together. I wore my grandmother's dress, and David's eyes filled with tears when I walked down the makeshift aisle. We were happy, genuinely, completely happy. So when I saw Marcus across the crowded farmers market in Bozeman on that crisp Saturday morning in October, it took me a moment to recognize him. He looked older, softer around the edges, his hair thinning at the crown. He was examining apples at a vendor's stall, apparently alone. I froze, my hand tightening around the paper bag of fresh bread I'd just purchased. 5 years of healing, of moving forward, of building something beautiful from the ashes of what he'd destroyed. And suddenly he was right there, 30 feet away. David noticed my sudden stillness immediately. "Sarah, what's wrong?" I couldn't speak, couldn't move. I just stared at the man who had once promised to love and protect me, then left me stranded in the desert like a piece of unwanted luggage. Marcus must have sensed someone watching him, because he turned, and our eyes met. Across the busy market, the apple he'd been holding tumbled from his fingers and rolled across the ground. His face went through a series of expressions so quickly I could barely track them all. Surprise, recognition, something that might have been guilt, and finally, something like hunger. His eyes swept over me, taking in the changes 5 years had wrought. The confidence in my posture, the peace in my expression, the obvious contentment that radiated from every pore. Then his gaze shifted to David, who had moved protectively to my side, one gentle hand resting on my lower back. Marcus's face went white. David was everything Marcus wasn't, and it showed. Where Marcus was average height and soft around the middle, David was tall and lean, his body hardened by years of outdoor work and mountain hiking. Where Marcus's eyes held a calculating quality, David's were warm and honest. Where Marcus had always demanded attention, David commanded respect simply by existing. But it wasn't just the physical comparison that made Marcus freeze like a deer in headlights. It was the way David looked at me, the way he stood beside me, not like a protector or possessor, but like a partner. An equal dot. Marcus took a step forward, his mouth opening as if to speak, but I found my voice first. "Hello, Marcus." My voice was steady, calm. There was no anger in it, no hurt, just acknowledgement. The kind of tone you might use to greet an acquaintance you hadn't seen in years and had no particular desire to see again. "Sarah," he breathed, and I could hear the shock in that single word. You look incredible." I didn't respond to the compliment. Instead, I turned slightly toward David, a small smile playing at the corners of my mouth. "David, this is Marcus, my ex-husband." "Marcus, this is David, my husband." The word husband hit Marcus like a physical blow. His eyes widened, and I watched him struggle to process the information. The woman he had abandoned, the woman he and his brothers had left stranded as a joke, had not only survived, but thrived, had found love again, had moved on so completely that his presence barely registered as more than a mild inconvenience. "Husband," Marcus repeated, the word strange on his tongue. David extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Marcus shook it. I watched my ex-husband's face as he felt the calluses on David's palm, the strength in his grip. This wasn't a soft city man who could be intimidated or impressed by cruel humor. "Nice to meet you," David said, and his voice carried the kind, of quiet authority that made it clear he knew exactly who Marcus was and what he had done. There was no hostility in his tone, but there was a subtle warning, a line drawn in the sand that said, quite clearly, that the woman beside him was under his protection now. Marcus seemed to shrink under that steady gaze. Sarah, I've thought about you over the years, about that day. I tilted my head, slightly, studying him with the detached interest of a scientist observing a specimen. Have you? God, yes, every day. I was such an idiot. We all were. It was supposed to be harmless, but he trailed off, apparently realizing how hollow any excuse would sound. But it wasn't harmless, I finished for him. It was cruel. He flinched as if I'd slapped him. I know that now. I tried to call you after to apologize, but you'd changed your number, and then the divorce papers came, and I realized how badly I'd screwed up. I could feel David's presence beside me, solid and reassuring, not possessive or jealous, just there, ready to support me in whatever way I needed. Marcus, I said gently, what you did that day wasn't just a prank. It was a betrayal of everything marriage is supposed to mean. You took someone who trusted you completely and deliberately caused them pain for your own amusement. His face crumpled. I know. Jesus, Sarah, I know. I've regretted it every day since. My brothers and I, we don't even speak anymore. That day changed everything, changed all of us. I felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy, but it was distant, muted, like feeling sorry for a character in a book whose troubles didn't really touch your life. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and I meant it. I was sorry that 3 grown men had destroyed their relationships over such a stupid, senseless act of cruelty. But I wasn't sorry that I had escaped the wreckage. Marcus's eyes darted between David and me, and I could see him struggling with something. Finally, he seemed to gather his courage. Sarah, I know I have no right to ask this, but could we talk alone, just for a few minutes? There are things I need to say, things I should have said years ago. David's hand tightened slightly on my back, not restraining but questioning. The decision was mine, and he would support whatever I chose. I considered it for a moment. 5 years ago, I would have been desperate to hear his apology, to understand why he had done what he did. I would have craved the validation of his regret, the acknowledgement of his mistakes. But the woman standing in this farmer's market wasn't that woman anymore. I had healed. I had grown. I had found something infinitely better than what I'd lost. No, Marcus, I said softly. I don't think that would be helpful for either of us. His face fell, but he nodded as if he'd expected that answer. I understand. But Sarah, I want you to know that I'm sorry. Truly, deeply sorry. What I did was unforgivable, and I've spent every day since trying to become the kind of man who would never do something like that again. I studied his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but all I saw was genuine remorse. It didn't change anything, of course. Some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt. But it mattered that he understood the weight of what he'd done. I believe you, I said, and I hope you have become that man. Not for me, but for yourself, and for whoever else might trust you with their heart someday. David stepped forward then, not aggressively, but with purpose. It was good to meet you, Marcus, he said, his tone making it clear that the conversation was over. Marcus nodded, understanding the dismissal. He looked at me one last time, his eyes memorizing my face as if he was trying to burn this moment into his memory. "Take care of yourself, Sarah," he said quietly. "You deserve all the happiness in the world." And then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of Saturday morning shoppers. David and I stood in silence for a moment, watching him go. Then David turned to me, his eyes searching my face with gentle concern. "Are you okay?" he asked. I considered the question seriously. Was I okay? I felt ... peaceful, closed, as if a chapter that had been left unfinished had finally reached its natural end. "Yes," I said, and I was surprised to realize how completely true that was. "I'm okay. Better than okay, actually." David smiled, that warm, wonderful smile that had first made me believe in love again. "Good, because we still need to pick up those tomatoes for tonight's dinner." I laughed, the sound bright and genuine in the crisp mountain air. "The tomatoes, of course." As we walked deeper into the market, David's hand found mine, our fingers intertwining in the easy, comfortable way of people who belonged together. Behind us, Marcus was already becoming a memory again, a figure from a past I had long since moved beyond. The sun climbed higher in the sky, warming my face as I squeezed my husband's hand. Around us, life continued in all its beautiful, ordinary glory. Children laughed, vendors called out their prices, couples debated the merits of different varieties of squash. I had been stranded once, left alone by someone who claimed to love me, but I had found my way home, not to a place, but to a person, to a life built on respect and kindness and genuine affection. The woman Marcus had abandoned in that desert 5 years ago was gone, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, more complete. Someone who knew her own worth and wouldn't settle for anything less than she deserved. Someone who was exactly where she belonged. As David and I selected perfect red tomatoes from a farmer's table, I caught myself smiling. The past was the past. The future stretched ahead of us like an endless mountain vista, full of possibility and promise. And I had never been happier to be exactly where I was. The divorce papers trembled in my hands as I sat in the kitchen that had once been filled with laughter and the smell of Sunday morning pancakes. The morning light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the marble countertops. I had carefully selected 3 years ago. Everything in this house held a memory, and now, it seemed, everything would need new meaning. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and for 12 years, I thought I knew exactly who I was. I was the wife of David Mitchell, a successful marketing executive. I was the woman who had built our dream home from the ground up, who had chosen every piece of furniture, every paint color, every carefully curated detail that made our house a home. But sitting there with those papers in my lap, I realized I had been living a carefully constructed lie. The discovery had come 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday that started like any other. David had left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he rushed upstairs to grab his forgotten tie. The screen displayed an email chain that made my heart stop beating for what felt like an eternity. Messages between my husband and his secretary, filled with promises and plans that had nothing to do with our marriage and everything to do with a future I wasn't part of. I remember standing there, my coffee growing cold in my hands, reading words that shattered 12 years of trust in a matter of minutes. The emails dated back 8 months, detailing secret meetings. Weekend getaways, I had been told, were business trips, and discussions about how they would be together once David sorted things out at home. When David returned to the kitchen, straightening his tie with the same casual confidence he had worn every morning for over a decade, I simply closed the laptop and said nothing. Some women might have confronted him immediately, might have screamed or thrown things, or demanded explanations. But I had always been the type to think first and act second, to process and plan rather than react in the heat of emotion. For 3 weeks, I had carried the weight of his betrayal silently, watching him come home each evening with kisses on his cheek and stories about his day that I now knew were carefully edited versions of the truth. I had sat across from him at dinner, making conversation about our respective days while inside. I was crumbling piece by piece. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal itself, though that cut deep enough. It was the realization that I had become invisible in my own life. David looked at me each morning and evening as though I were simply part of the furniture, something familiar and comfortable, but no longer worthy of real attention or consideration. I had become the background to his story, rather than the co-author I had always believed myself to be during those 3 weeks of silent knowing. I had done something I had never imagined myself capable of. I had begun planning, not just for the conversation we would eventually have, or for the divorce that seemed inevitable, but for the life I would build afterward. I had always been organized, but this was different. This was strategic. I scheduled a meeting with Margaret Chen, the best divorce attorney in the city, a woman whose reputation for thorough preparation was legendary. I gathered financial documents, photographed important items, and began the careful work of documenting a life I was preparing to leave behind. It was during one of these documentation sessions that I made a discovery that would change everything. As I photographed rooms for the asset division, I began pulling out receipts and warranty information from my meticulously organized filing system. That was when I realized something that should have been obvious but had somehow escaped my notice. Over the years of marriage and mortgage payments and shared bank accounts, every single item in our house, from the king-sized bed in our master bedroom to the hand-carved dining table that seated 8, from the leather sectional sofa to the vintage Persian rug beneath it, had been purchased by me, not by us, as I had somehow come to think of it over the years, but by me. My name was on every receipt, every warranty, every insurance claim. The house itself was mine, purchased 6 months before David and I had even gotten engaged, using money from my inheritance and my own savings account. When we married, David had simply moved in, bringing with him little more than his clothes and a collection of sports memorabilia that now seemed insignificant compared to the life we had built together. At the time, it hadn't mattered whose name was on what document. We were building a life together, and the legal details seemed less important than the emotional reality of our partnership. I had been happy to provide the foundation, while he provided the companionship, the shared dreams, the promise of forever. But now, sitting with those divorce papers and the weight of his betrayal heavy in my chest, those legal details suddenly mattered very much indeed. David arrived home that evening with the same casual confidence he always wore, loosening his tie as he walked through the front door and calling out his usual greeting. "Hey, babe, I'm home. What's for dinner?" I was waiting for him in the living room, The divorce papers spread out on the coffee table like playing cards in a game where I finally understood all the rules. When he saw me sitting there, something in my posture must have alerted him that this was not going to be an ordinary evening. Sarah, what's all this? He gestured toward the papers, his voice carrying the same tone he might use to ask about an unexpected package delivery. Divorce papers, David. The words came out steadier than I had expected, without the tremor of emotion I had feared would betray the depth of my hurt. He sat down heavily in the chair across from me, his face cycling through expressions of surprise, confusion, and then something that looked almost like relief. I don't understand. Where is this coming from? I thought we were happy. The irony of his question wasn't lost on me. We had been happy, or at least I had been, right up until the moment I discovered that happiness had been built on a foundation of lies and half-truths. I know about Jessica, I said simply, watching as the color drained from his face. I know about the trips, the hotels, the plans you've been making. What followed was exactly what I had expected. The stammering excuses, the promises to change, the claims that it didn't mean anything, that he loved me, that we could work through this. All the predictable words that men say when they're caught between the life they've been living and the life they've been planning to live. I let him talk. Let him exhaust himself with explanations and justifications, and then I said the words that would change everything. I've already filed the papers, David. This isn't a negotiation. His face hardened then, the mask of contrition slipping away, to reveal something colder underneath. Fine, he said, standing up and straightening his shoulders. But you're not taking me to the cleaners, Sarah. I've worked too hard for too many years to build this life. Our life, I corrected quietly. Whatever, you know what I mean. We'll split everything 50-50, and we'll both move on. That was. When I smiled, a small, calm smile that seemed to unnerve him more than any amount of crying or shouting might have. Actually, David, that's not quite how this is going to work. I stood up then, moving to the window that overlooked the garden I had planted and maintained for 7 years. I've been thinking a lot about what you said in one of your emails to Jessica, about how you couldn't wait to be rid of me and all my belongings. He had the grace to look embarrassed, but not apologetic. Sarah, you weren't supposed to see those. I was angry, frustrated. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. Oh, but I think you did mean it exactly the way it sounded. I turned back to face him, my voice still calm, still steady. You told her that once you got rid of me, you'd have this beautiful house and all its contents to start your new life together. You talked about how you'd worked so hard to build all of this. I did work hard, he said defensively. I've been the primary breadwinner for years. Yes, you have worked hard, and yes, you've contributed financially to our household expenses. But there's something you seem to have forgotten, something that's going to make this divorce much simpler than you anticipated. I walked back to the coffee table and picked up a thick manila folder I had prepared for this moment. This house, David, is mine, not ours, mine. I bought it 6 months before we were engaged, with my own money, and your name was never added to the deed. His face went very still, the kind of stillness that comes before understanding hits like a freight train. And this furniture, this beautiful sectional you love to watch football on, mine, the dining room set where we've hosted Christmas dinner for your family every year, mine, the king-sized bed you sleep in every night, mine, the kitchen appliances you use every morning to make your coffee. Mine, I opened the folder and began laying out receipts, warranty cards, and insurance documents, each one bearing my name alone. 12 years of building a home together, and it turns out I built it entirely with my own resources, while you simply lived in it. David stared at the papers spread before him as though they were written in a language he couldn't understand. That's not ... that can't be. We were married. What's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine. Actually, that's not how it works in this state, David. Since we never specifically added your name to any of these purchases or to the deed of the house, and since I can document that every single item was purchased with funds from my own accounts, they remain my separate property.